The Vithara had a name for species like humanity. The name translates roughly as harvestable, though that translation loses something. In the original Vitharan, the word carries a secondary meaning closer to that which yields without sustained resistance. It was a classification, not an insult. The Vithara did not think in terms of cruelty. They thought in terms of categories, and for the 1100 years of their expansion across the Orion Spur, every species they had encountered had fallen into one of three categories. Harvestable, meaning it could be subjugated and its resources extracted within a standard campaign cycle. Avoidable, meaning the cost of subjugation exceeded the value of the resources. And pure, meaning the species operated at a technological level comparable to the Vethara's own and was therefore subject to diplomacy rather than conquest. In 1100 years, they had encountered 419 species. 371 were harvestable, 46 were avoidable, 2 were peers. The system worked. The categories were reliable. The Vithara had not needed to revise them in over 6 centuries. Humanity was classified as harvestable on first survey. The survey was conducted remotely using long-range probes that entered the Sol system in what humans would record as the year 1987. The probes spent approximately 4 months collecting data on the planet's electromagnetic output, atmospheric composition, orbital infrastructure, and military capability. The findings were consistent with a mid-stage industrial civilization, nuclear capability, primitive orbital presence, no faster-than-light technology, no energy shielding, no directed energy weapons, fragmented governance across competing national entities. The classification report was filed, and Earth was added to the Vithara's expansion queue, scheduled for subjugation at a time determined by logistical convenience and fleet availability. That time came 39 years later, in what humans call 2026. The subjugation fleet was standard: 80 combat vessels, 6 troop transports, 2 orbital suppression platforms, and a command carrier. The force was considered more than adequate. Against a harvestable world, the standard deployment was 40 vessels. Earth received double because of its population density and nuclear capability, both of which were expected to increase the suppression timeline from the typical 2 weeks to perhaps 6. The fleet commander, a senior officer named Torath Vel, had overseen 9 previous subjugations and expected Earth to be his 10th and final campaign before retirement. He later described his pre-arrival mindset as administrative. He was not preparing for war. He was preparing for processing. The fleet arrived in Earth orbit on March 11, 2026, and broadcast a standard subjugation notice in 73 human languages. The notice informed Earth's governments that the planet was now under Vitharan administration, that resistance would result in orbital bombardment of population centers, and that compliance would be met with integration into the Vitharan labor and resource network, under conditions that, while not comfortable, would permit the continuation of the species. The notice gave Earth's governments 48 hours to respond with formal acceptance. Earth's governments did not accept. But they also did not respond with the disorganized, frantic refusal the Vithara typically encountered from harvestable worlds. What they did was go quiet. For approximately 31 hours, Earth's electromagnetic output dropped to near zero. Military communications went silent. Civilian broadcasts ceased. Satellite uplinks shut down. The planet, from the Vethara's orbital perspective, appeared to simply stop talking. Torath Vel interpreted the silence as paralysis. Shock response. Shock. A civilization confronting the reality of its own insignificance and failing to process it within the decision window. He had seen it before. 2 of his previous 9 campaigns had featured an initial silence period, both times followed by fragmented, desperate resistance that collapsed within days. He expected Earth to follow the same pattern and authorized ground deployment preparations on schedule. He was wrong about the silence. The silence was coordination. During those 31 hours, every major military power on Earth activated contingency protocols that had been developed in secret over the previous 19 years since a joint intelligence assessment in 2007 had concluded, based on analysis of the 1987 probe, data that had been partially detected by ground-based observatories, that the probe was artificial and that its origin species was likely to return. 19 years of preparation conducted under the highest classification levels available across a dozen nations that had publicly continued to behave as geopolitical rivals while privately sharing intelligence, technology, and strategic planning through a network so restricted that fewer than 4,000 people on the entire planet knew it existed. The network was called Vigil. It had no public presence, no official charter, no line item in any national budget that could be traced without knowing what to look for. It was funded through defense allocations that appeared on paper to support conventional weapons programs, satellite upgrades, or infrastructure hardening. Its research was conducted in facilities that were officially designated as climate research stations, mining operations, or decommissioned military bases. Its personnel were drawn from every participating nation's military, intelligence, and scientific communities, and every one of them had been selected for a single quality: the ability to keep working on a problem for 2 decades without knowing whether the problem would ever arrive. The psychological screening for Vigil recruits was more rigorous than for any combat unit in any nation's military. They were selected not for bravery, but for patience, for the capacity to prepare for something they might never face, and to do so with total commitment, in total secrecy, for the duration of their professional lives. By 2026, Vigil had been operational for 19 years. It had developed technology, strategy, and infrastructure across 12 nations without a single significant security breach. The compartmentalization was absolute. Intelligence agencies that prided themselves on knowing everything did not know about Vigil. Defense ministers came and went without being briefed. Presidents and prime ministers were informed on a strictly need-to-know basis, and most of them needed to know only one thing: that if the signal came, the military would know what to do, and their role was to stay out of the way for the first 72 hours. Vigil's primary output was threefold. First, a global defense coordination system that could unify Earth's fragmented military forces under a single command architecture within hours. Second, a suite of weapon systems derived from analysis of the 1987 probe's material composition and energy signature, designed to be effective against whatever technology the probe's creators possessed. Third, and most relevant to what happened next, a mobilization doctrine. The doctrine was built on a calculation that Vigil's strategic planners had made early and revisited often. Earth's standing military forces, even if unified, would be insufficient to resist a sustained extraterrestrial military campaign. The professional military of every nation on Earth, combined, numbered approximately 27 million active duty personnel. Against an invasion force of unknown size and technological superiority, 27 million was not enough. The number was too small, and the training pipeline to produce more professional soldiers was too slow. A conventional mobilization, the kind that nations had used in world wars, called up reserves and conscripted civilians. But reserves required months to activate, and conscripts required even longer to train. Against an opponent that could sterilize population centers from orbit, months were a resource Earth would not have. Vigil's planners needed a force that could deploy immediately, that was already trained, that was psychologically conditioned for combat, that was distributed globally across every participating nation, and that could be integrated into the unified command structure without a lengthy conversion process. They needed soldiers who were already soldiers, even if they had stopped being soldiers years or decades earlier. They needed veterans. Earth's veteran population as of 2026 was approximately 55 million people, 55 million men and women, spread across every continent, ranging in age from their 20s to their 80s, who had served in their nation's armed forces and returned to civilian life. Some had served in combat zones in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Colombia, the Korean Peninsula, the Congo, and a dozen other conflicts that had produced experienced fighters across multiple generations. Some had served in peacetime roles that nonetheless provided weapons training, tactical communication proficiency, and operational discipline. Some had left service decades ago. Some had left months ago. What they shared was something no amount of money could purchase, and no training program could replicate quickly: the lived experience of military service, weapons handling, tactical awareness, familiarity with military communication, hierarchy, and operational tempo. The ability to follow orders under pressure, the ability to function when terrified, the ability to move, shoot, take cover, maintain equipment, and endure conditions that would paralyze untrained civilians. They knew what incoming fire sounded like. They knew what it felt like to be cold, exhausted, hungry, and still required to perform. They knew how to sleep for 20 minutes and wake ready to fight. And 55 million of them were sitting in offices, workshops, farms, classrooms, hospitals, and retirement homes around the world, living ordinary lives, carrying the residue of their service in their bodies and their reflexes when the veteran fleet appeared in orbit. Vigil's mobilization doctrine was called Protocol 9. It was the 9th and final contingency plan in the Vigil framework, reserved for the scenario that all the others were designed to delay or prevent confirmed hostile contact with no prospect of diplomatic resolution. Protocol 9 activated the veteran recall. The recall was not compulsory. Vigil's planners had debated conscription and rejected it, for a reason that speaks to something the Vithara did not understand about humanity, and that I believe is central to everything that followed. The planners rejected conscription because they calculated that it would be unnecessary. Their modeling, based on historical data from every major conflict in human history, predicted that a voluntary recall of veterans in the face of an existential threat to the species would produce a response rate of between 60 and 70%. 33 to 38 million volunteers, more than enough to supplement the standing military and sustain a global defense. The actual response rate was 81%. 44.6 million veterans across every participating nation responded to the Protocol 9 activation within the first 72 hours. They reported to designated assembly points, were processed through Vigil's pre-established mobilization infrastructure, received updated equipment compatible with the new weapon systems, and were integrated into the unified command architecture. The oldest volunteer accepted was a 91-year-old Korean War veteran in the United States who had to be turned away from a combat assignment but was given a logistics coordination role, which he performed for the next 14 months. The youngest were men and women in their early 20s who had left active service only months before the invasion. The Vithara did not know any of this was happening during the 31 hours of silence. They did not know because Vigil's communication blackout was specifically designed to prevent electromagnetic detection of the mobilization. The recall was transmitted through a network of hardened landline connections, physical couriers, and pre-positioned activation devices that did not require satellite uplinks or radio transmission. The Vithara's intelligence division, which was monitoring Earth's electromagnetic spectrum for signs of military coordination, detected nothing. They concluded that Earth's military was paralyzed. On March 12th, Toreth Vel authorized the first ground deployments. 6 troop transports descended through the atmosphere and began landing operations at 6 points distributed across the planet's most densely populated regions: Eastern North America, Western Europe, Eastern China, the Indian subcontinent, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. Standard doctrine: secure population centers first, neutralize military infrastructure second, establish administrative control third. The first transport landed outside what the humans call Shanghai at approximately 0400 local time. The landing force was a standard veteran ground battalion, 3,000 soldiers equipped with personal energy shields, directed energy sidearms, and armored transport vehicles. They expected to encounter either surrender or disorganized resistance from a local military garrison. What they encountered instead was a prepared defensive position manned by approximately 22,000 human combatants. 14,000 of them were veterans who had been civilians 48 hours earlier. They were armed with weapons that the Vithara's pre-invasion survey had not detected because the weapons had not existed during the survey. Vigil's research division had spent 19 years developing kinetic accelerators and electromagnetic pulse systems designed specifically to counter the energy shielding technology that the 1987 probe's analysis had suggested the probe's creators would use. The weapons worked. Not perfectly, not elegantly, but they worked. The first Vithran energy shield was breached 12 minutes into the engagement by a modified railgun round fired by a 63-year-old former artillery sergeant named Chen Baohua, who had retired from the People's Liberation Army in 2012 and had spent the 14 intervening years running a machine shop in Wuxi. He had been recalled under Protocol 9, processed through the Shanghai Assembly Point, assigned to a heavy weapons unit, and given 4 hours of training on the new weapon system before being deployed to the defensive line. He fired the round that broke the first shield, and the footage of that moment, captured by a military drone, was distributed to every human combat unit on the planet within the hour. The effect was immediate, not just tactical, psychological. Every human soldier and every human veteran on every front now knew that the shields could be broken, that the invaders were not invulnerable, that the weapons worked, that the training had been right and the preparation had been worth it, and that a 63-year-old machinist from Wuxi had proven it. The Shanghai landing force was driven back to its transport within 9 hours. The transport lifted off under fire and returned to orbit with 60% casualties. Toreth Vel received the after-action report and, for the first time in his career, requested a tactical pause before proceeding with the remaining 5 landings. The pause lasted 6 hours. During that time, Vell reviewed the Shanghai data and attempted to reconcile it with the pre-invasion survey. The survey had classified Earth's military as fragmented, technologically inferior, and incapable of coordinated resistance. The Shanghai engagement showed a unified, pre-positioned, well-equipped force that had been waiting for the Vithara to land. Vell's intelligence officer suggested that the survey data was outdated by 39 years, and that Earth's military capability had advanced beyond the initial assessment. Vell accepted this explanation and authorized the remaining landings with increased force. Each transport was reinforced with additional armor and close air support elements drawn from the combat vessels in orbit. The reinforced landings fared better than Shanghai. The Vithara established ground positions at 4 of the 5 remaining sites and held them for between 3 and 12 days, but they did not advance beyond the initial perimeters. At every position, the Vithara encountered the same thing: prepared defenses, vigil-designed weapons, and a defending force that was far larger and far more experienced than any harvestable world's military had ever been. In Western Europe, the landing outside Frankfurt was met by a combined force of German, French, Polish, and British veterans who had fought in Afghanistan, Mali, and a half-dozen other theaters, now operating under a single command structure with weapons they had trained on for less than a week. In India, the landing near Kolkata was contested by a force that included veterans from 3 separate Indo-Pakistani conflicts, men in their 60s and 70s who had retired from the Indian Army decades earlier and who reactivated with a quiet professionalism that their younger colleagues found both inspiring and slightly unnerving. In sub-Saharan Africa, the landing near Lagos was met by veterans from Nigerian, Ghanaian, Kenyan, and South African armed forces, many of whom had served in UN peacekeeping operations across the continent, and who brought a familiarity with improvised logistics and harsh environment operations that proved immediately relevant, because the defenders were not just soldiers, they were veterans, people who had already fought wars, people who had lived through combat, processed the trauma, returned to civilian life, and then, when the signal came, gone back. Not because they were ordered to, because they volunteered. 44.6 million of them. Torth Vell later described the moment he understood what he was facing. It was not during the Shanghai engagement. It was 3 days later, when his intelligence division completed a demographic analysis of the prisoners taken during the European landing. The analysis showed that the captured fighters ranged in age from 22 to 74, that they had served in different nations' armies, in different decades, in different wars, that they spoke different languages and had been trained in different tactical doctrines, and that they had been integrated into a single command structure in less than 72 hours. Vell said, "I asked my intelligence officer how a harvestable world could produce 40 million trained soldiers in 3 days. She told me they did not produce them. They already had them. They had been growing them for their entire history, through every conflict they had ever fought, and they had kept every one of them. The Vithara did not have veterans. No species in their experience did. When a veteran soldier completed service, they were neurologically reconditioned to civilian status, their combat training suppressed through a chemical process that the Vithara considered humane and necessary to prevent post-service instability. A Vitharan who had served 20 years in the military returned to civilian life with no more combat capability than they had possessed before enlistment. The knowledge was removed. The reflexes were dampened. The psychological conditioning was reversed. This was standard across every species the Vithara had studied. The Kalahari did the same through genetic reversion. The Tayari did it through cognitive compartmentalization. The Rathori simply did not permit soldiers to return to civilian life at all, maintaining a permanent military caste that never integrated with the general population. Every species, in its own way, ensured that the capacity for violence was controlled, contained, and separated from ordinary social existence. The concept of a former soldier who retained all combat capabilities while living as a civilian, who carried the full weight of military training inside a body that also held a family, a job, a mortgage, a daily commute, and an ordinary human life, was to the Vithara not just unfamiliar. It was architecturally alien. Their social systems were not built to accommodate it. Their strategic models did not account for it. The idea that a species would allow millions of combat-trained individuals to simply live among the general population, working ordinary jobs, raising families, growing old, while retaining every skill and instinct their training had given them, struck the Vithara as either catastrophically negligent or genuinely insane. It was, in fact, the single most significant military asset humanity possessed. Not any weapon, not any technology, the veterans. The living reservoir of combat experience distributed across the entire civilian population, maintained not by policy or program, but by the simple fact that humans do not erase what they have learned. They carry it, all of it, the skill and the cost together. And when the moment came, 44.6 million of them picked it up again and walked toward the fight. That is where Part 1 ends. Not with the war concluded, but with the Vithara beginning to understand what they had landed on. Not a harvestable world, not an avoidable one, not even a peer. Something their classification system had no word for. A world where the civilian population was the military reserve, where retirement did not mean disarmament, where every generation's wars produced a residue of readiness that accumulated across centuries and could be activated in hours. The Vithara had landed on a planet that remembered every fight it had ever been in, and every fighter. The ground war lasted 14 months. I will not recount every engagement because the military record is extensive, and because the strategic picture is more important than the tactical details. The strategic picture is this: the Vithara could not advance. Their ground forces held their initial perimeters, reinforced them, attempted breakout operations on multiple occasions, and were pushed back every time. Not because the human forces were technologically superior, they were not. The Vigil weapons were effective against Vitheran shielding, but remained crude by interstellar standards. The humans had no energy weapons of their own. Their armor was conventional. Their transport was ground-based and atmospheric. Their communications, while integrated under the Vigil architecture, were electromagnetic and therefore interceptable. What the humans had was depth. The word kept appearing in veteran after-action reports. Depth. Every defensive line the Vithara penetrated revealed another line behind it. Every unit they destroyed was replaced by another unit within days. Every tactic they countered was adapted and returned in a modified form within a week. The depth was not physical, though the terrain contributed. The depth was human. It was the 44 million veterans, feeding into the front in a continuous rotation that the Vithara's logistics models could not exhaust because the models were calibrated for professional standing armies, not for a civilization that could draw soldiers from its entire adult population on a voluntary basis. The rotation itself was something the Vithara found difficult to process. Human veterans served in combat for periods of weeks or months, then rotated out and returned to support roles or, in some cases, to civilian life, while other veterans rotated in. The same individual might fight on the Frankfurt perimeter in April, return to a logistics center in June, and be back on a combat line in September, not at the same location, but at whatever front needed reinforcement. They cycled through with a fluidity that the Vithara's rigid command structure could not match. A veteran soldier was assigned to a unit and remained in that unit until the campaign ended or the soldier was killed. The concept of rotating experienced combatants through multiple assignments, drawing on a reservoir of millions who had already proven they could function in combat, was not part of Vitheran doctrine because it was not part of any doctrine the Vithara had ever encountered. By month 6 of the ground campaign, the Vithara controlled less territory than they had held at the end of the first week. Their casualty rate had exceeded the campaign projection by a factor of 11. Their supply lines from orbit were under constant harassment from human anti-orbital weapons that Vigil had deployed during the first month, modified versions of the same kinetic accelerators that had breached the first shield at Shanghai, scaled up and mounted on mobile platforms that were difficult to target from orbit because the humans moved them constantly. The Vithara still controlled orbital space. Their fleet was intact, and their suppression platforms could have, at any point, conducted orbital bombardment of human population centers. Toreth Vel had the authority to order bombardment. He chose not to, for reasons that deserve explanation because they are central to what happened afterward. Bombardment was the standard veteran response to sustained resistance. If ground forces could not achieve suppression within the campaign timeline, orbital bombardment of population centers was authorized to degrade the indigenous civilization's capacity to fight. It was a blunt instrument, but it was effective. It had been used on 14 previous worlds. In every case, the combination of mass civilian casualties and infrastructure destruction had broken the defending population's will to resist within weeks. Vel did not order bombardment because his intelligence division had concluded, based on 6 months of observation and extensive analysis of human historical behavior, that it would not work on Earth. The assessment was unusual and it was controversial within the fleet. Several of Vel's subordinate commanders advocated for bombardment, arguing that it had resolved every previous extended campaign and that the precedent was clear. But Vel's intelligence officer, Dakari Vel, who was his niece and who I mentioned by name because her analysis was the single most important Vetheran document produced during the entire campaign, argued against it with a thoroughness that silenced the room. Her reasoning was built on data the humans themselves had generated. During the 6 months of ground fighting, Vetheran intelligence had captured extensive archives of human military history from overrun libraries, data centers, and university facilities. Dakari's team had spent 4 months studying these archives, and what they found changed the Vethara's understanding of the species they were fighting. The humans had not only fought 15,000 wars against each other, they had documented every one. They had analyzed their own conflicts with a scholarly rigor that the Vethara found remarkable and slightly disturbing, producing libraries of strategic theory, psychological research, and historical analysis that amounted to a 5,000-year manual on how to wage war. And the data was clear on one point: aerial bombardment of civilian populations did not produce surrender. In every documented case from their own history, from the firebombing of their cities during what they called the Second World War, through decades of strategic bombing campaigns in Asia and the Middle East, the targeted population's will to fight increased after bombardment. It did not decrease. It hardened. Dakari's assessment concluded with a statement that Vel later described as the most disturbing sentence his intelligence division had ever produced. The statement read, "Bombardment of human population centers is assessed as counterproductive because the human species treats attacks on its non-combatants as a personal offense, individually and collectively, and responds with escalatory commitment that exceeds the military benefit of the HFY. Bombardment by an order of magnitude. Furthermore, bombardment would likely unify the remaining uncommitted portion of the civilian population behind the war effort, potentially increasing the human combat force by an additional 20 to 40 million personnel." Vel accepted the assessment. He did not order bombardment. Instead, he requested reinforcements from Vetheran High Command. The request was partially granted. An additional 30 combat vessels and 4 troop transports arrived in Earth orbit in month 8. The reinforcements increased the Vethara's ground strength by approximately 60%. They did not change the strategic situation. The humans adapted to the increased force within weeks, shifted their defensive deployments, and continued to hold every major front. What changed the war was not a battle. It was a conversation. In month 11, a human unit operating near the Frankfurt perimeter captured a Vetheran officer during a failed breakout attempt. The officer, a battalion commander named Soreth Kai, was the highest-ranking Vetheran to be taken alive during the campaign. Standard Vetheran doctrine required captured officers to refuse communication. Kai, who had been wounded during capture and was receiving medical treatment from human field medics, did not follow standard doctrine. He spoke. The conversation was recorded by the human intelligence team present. It was later translated, verified, and entered into the Vigil archive. I have reviewed the transcript in its entirety. The relevant exchange occurred between Kai and a human interrogator, a retired military intelligence officer named Maria Santos, who had served in Colombia and Afghanistan before leaving the army in 2019, and who had been recalled under Protocol 9. Santos was 54 years old. She conducted the interrogation in English, with translation provided by a Vigil-developed linguistic interface. Santos asked Kai why the Vethara had come to Earth. Kai explained the classification system: harvestable, avoidable, peer. He explained that Earth had been classified as harvestable. Santos asked what would happen if the classification was wrong. Kai said the classification had never been wrong. Santos said, "It's wrong now." Kai was silent for approximately 10 seconds. Then he asked Santos a question. He asked how Earth had produced so many soldiers so quickly. He said that his intelligence estimates prior to invasion had identified Earth's standing military at approximately 27 million. He asked where the other 40 million had come from. Santos told him. She explained the concept of veterans. She explained that human soldiers, when they leave the military, retain all their training, that they live among the civilian population, that they work ordinary jobs, that they raise families, that they grow old, and that when their world is threatened, they come back. She said that the 44 million people who had responded to the recall were not new soldiers. They were old soldiers. They had already fought wars. Some of them had fought 2 or 3. They had already learned how to kill and how to survive, and they had carried that knowledge with them through every year of their civilian lives. And when the Vithara arrived, they had simply picked up weapons and returned to what they already knew how to do. Santos said this calmly. She was not boasting. She was explaining a fact of her species' existence the way one might explain a geographical feature or a climatic pattern. It was simply how humans worked. Kai listened. When Santos finished, he was quiet for some time. Then he asked a follow-up question that the transcript records as delivered in a flat, toneless voice that the human translator flagged as consistent with psychological distress. He asked, "How many wars have your people fought?" Santos thought about it. She said she could not give him an exact number because the historiography was contested, and the definition of what constituted a distinct conflict varied by culture and period. But she said that in the recorded history of human civilization, which spanned roughly 5,000 years, there had been an estimated 15,000 armed conflicts of varying scale, from tribal skirmishes to wars that engulfed entire continents and killed tens of millions. She said that every generation of humans, on every continent, in every era, had produced soldiers who fought, survived, and returned to civilian life carrying what they had learned. She said the process had never stopped. There had never been a generation of humans that did not fight, not one, in 5,000 years. Kai did not speak for nearly a minute. Then he said, and the transcript records this with a notation indicating that his vocal affect was consistent with what humans would identify as quiet distress. "You are telling me that your species has been at war with itself for 5,000 years, and that every war produced survivors who retained combat experience, and that this experience accumulated across your entire population over the full duration of your civilization's existence." Santos confirmed that this was an accurate summary. Kai said, "Then your entire species is a military reserve." Santos said, "Yes, that's a reasonable way to put it." The transcript of the Santos-Kai conversation was transmitted to Torith Vel within hours of the interrogation. Vel read it and immediately convened a strategy session with his senior staff. The session lasted 12 hours. The conclusion was that the Earth campaign could not be won. Not with the current force, not with reinforcements, not with bombardment. The human species' capacity to generate experienced combatants was not a temporary advantage that could be exhausted through attrition. It was a structural characteristic of their civilization, built over millennia, and it meant that the pool of skilled fighters available to defend Earth was essentially the entire adult population that had ever served in any military capacity, across every nation, across every conflict in human history, still within living memory. The Vithara had landed on a world with 55 million veterans and a standing military of 27 million. 82 million people with military experience on a planet of 8 billion. And behind them, another generation growing up in a civilization that was now, for the first time, unified in purpose and rapidly converting its industrial capacity to military production using technology derived from 19 years of preparation and 14 months of live-fire adaptation. The numbers would only grow. Every month the campaign continued. The humans learned more about veteran technology, adapted their weapons further, trained more civilians, and integrated more veterans into more sophisticated operational roles. The Vithara were fighting against a species that got stronger the longer the fight lasted, because every engagement produced more experience, and every experience was retained. Vel transmitted his recommendation to High Command in month 13. He recommended withdrawal. His message was 3 pages long. The essential argument was contained in one sentence. We cannot exhaust a species that converts its own suffering into military capability. High Command deliberated for 6 weeks. During that time, the ground campaign continued, and the Vithara lost an additional 11,000 personnel. On the 43rd day of deliberation, High Command authorized withdrawal. The order was transmitted to Vel with a classification that had never before been applied to a campaign termination in Vitharan military history. The classification translated as strategic revaluation, which was the closest Vitharan administrative language could come to the concept of admitting that a harvestable world was none of the 3 things the classification system allowed a world to be. The Vithara withdrew from Earth over a period of 9 days. Ground forces were extracted first, followed by orbital assets. The last Vitharan vessel left Earth orbit on June 2nd, 2027, 14 months and 22 days after the first transport had landed outside Shanghai. Total Vitharan casualties for the campaign were 41,000 killed, approximately 72,000 wounded, and 312 captured. Human casualties were higher. Approximately 208,000 killed, military and veteran combined, with an additional 600,000 wounded. The disparity reflected the technological gap that still favored the Vithara in individual engagements. The outcome reflected something that the technological gap could not overcome. Torith Vel filed his final campaign report upon returning to Vitharan territory. The report was 411 pages long and included a recommendation that Earth be reclassified. He proposed a new category, the first addition to the Vitharan classification system in 600 years. The category, in translation, meant approximately that which appears harvestable but contains within its civilian population a military capacity that exceeds its observable force by an order of magnitude, sustained by a species-wide practice of retaining combat experience across generational and demographic boundaries. The Vitharan administrative term for this, when the classification was eventually approved, was shorter. It translated roughly as Deep Reserve World. The classification has since been applied to one planet, Earth. The Vithara have not returned. Their expansion doctrine, which had operated on the three-category system for over a millennium, was formally revised 2 years after the Earth campaign. The revision acknowledged, for the first time in Vitharan strategic history, that the survey and classify model could produce catastrophic underestimates of a world's military capacity if the survey measured only technology and not the species' relationship to its own combat history. The revision was described internally as a technical correction. In practice, it was an admission that the Vithara had encountered something their entire civilizational model had not anticipated, a species that did not separate its warriors from its civilians, that did not erase its soldiers when it was finished with them, that allowed the residue of every conflict to settle into the bedrock of its population and remain there, dormant but intact, waiting. The galactic response to the Vitharan withdrawal from Earth was significant. 17 species that the Vithara had classified as harvestable and scheduled for future subjugation requested information about the Earth campaign through diplomatic channels. The details that emerged, distributed unevenly through trade networks, diplomatic communications, and intelligence channels, altered the strategic calculations of every species in the sector. If the Vithara could be stopped, the classification system that had governed 1,000 years of expansion was no longer reliable. If one harvestable world could fight off a full conquest fleet, the entire model was in question. The Vithara's expansion rate, which had averaged one new world every 4 to 5 years for 11 centuries, dropped to 0 in the 3 years following the Earth withdrawal. It has not recovered. Whether it ever will is a question the Vithara themselves appear unable to answer. The humans, for their part, did not rest. Within 2 years of the withdrawal, they had reverse-engineered multiple Vitharan technologies from captured equipment and battlefield salvage. Within 5 years, they had launched their first faster-than-light capable vessel, a modified military transport powered by a drive system derived from Vitharan propulsion technology and built in the same orbital shipyards that Vigil had covertly established in the decade before the invasion. Within 8 years, they had made contact with 4 of the 17 species that had requested information about the campaign and had begun forming what would eventually become the Terran Alliance Network, a mutual defense structure open to any species that requested assistance. The Alliance's founding document, which I have read in translation, contains a clause that I believe explains everything about humanity that the Vithara failed to understand. The clause states that membership in the Alliance does not require military contribution, economic payment, or political alignment. It requires only one thing: a request for help. Any species that asks for help receives it. The clause was written by a committee that included Maria Santos, who by then had been appointed to humanity's first interstellar diplomatic corps. When asked by an allied species representative why the Alliance's terms were so unconditional, Santos reportedly gave the same kind of answer she had given Kai in that interrogation room outside Frankfurt. She said, "Because that is how we are." I think about Chen Baohua sometimes, the 63-year-old machinist from Wuxi who fired the round that broke the first shield. He went back to his machine shop after the war. I know this because human journalists documented the stories of individual veterans after the withdrawal, and Baohua was among those profiled. He returned to Wuxi. He reopened his shop. He resumed the life he had been living before Protocol 9 activated. The same commute, the same workbench, the same customers. When asked by a journalist how he felt about returning to ordinary life after fighting an alien invasion, he said something that I think captures the essence of what the Vathra encountered and failed to understand. He said, "I was a soldier once, then I was a machinist, then I was a soldier again. Now I am a machinist again. I am always both. That does not go away. I am always both." That is the thing the Vathara did not have a classification for, not the weapons, not the preparation, not the secret program, or the unified command or the modified railguns. The thing they could not classify was the human veteran, the person who carries war inside a civilian life and does not put it down. The person who is a machinist and a soldier simultaneously, who lives in peace while retaining the full capacity for violence, and who will, if the moment requires it, set down the tools of one life and pick up the tools of the other without hesitation, without ceremony, and without requiring permission. The Vathara thought humanity was prey because their survey measured technology, infrastructure, and formal military strength. Those are the things you can see from orbit. What you cannot see from orbit is what people carry inside them. You cannot scan for experience. You cannot classify determination from a probe's dataset. You cannot look at a planet and know that its retired school teachers will run into collapsing buildings for strangers, that its machinists will fire anti-alien weapons they learn to use in 4 hours, that its 70-year-old grandfathers will drive through the night to join a defensive line. Because they remember what fighting feels like, and they are not afraid of remembering. The Vathara classified Earth as harvestable. They were correct about the technology. They were correct about the infrastructure. They were correct about the fragmented governance and the primitive orbital presence and the absence of faster-than-light travel. They were wrong about the people, and the people were the only variable that mattered.